You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are in our second week discussing Lorelei and the Laser Eyes, published by Annapurna Interactive, developed by Simogo. This escape room-esque, murder mystery-esque puzzle game is our last text for the year, and we've been having a hoot diving through it, figuring out all of the turns and tangles on stream, which you can find up on the website 2ser.com. Let's throw it over to Past Me just after we had finished our third session. The thing that really strikes me for the third session that we've just done is that we're getting much more into like a murder mystery sort of mindset with the direct happenstance of the case that we're sort of there witnessing.
It seems like we're now getting into the granular events that occurred. And part of that was the realization, if we take the different years that are described and convert them into 24-hour time, which is something that the game calls out. And so if we take 1847, 1963, and 2014 and turn them from three sets of years, because that was something that I was kind of having a mental block on. Like, how can we have one human that has lived from 1847 to 2014?
Like it either has to be metaphorical or we're playing a linguistic trick.
It's a time trick. The game is describing on the fateful day when all the bad stuff, when the murder happened at 1847, which is 6:47 p.m., something happened.
We've had stories that have dealt with metatext purgatory before, and this idea of the in-between time. So 1960 onwards, in the chronology of the years that this game mentions, they sort of fit into this space where they should become 6 p.m., but we could also interpret them as this crossover point into a time that can't exist based on the system we've sort of invented.
Part of what we've been exploring in this sort of section of the game is the psyche of our character a little bit more. Like, there are these investigation reports that talk about the mindset of our murder victim. And of course, the eternal question of, was it a murder or was it a suicide? Which means in murder mystery language that it...
Well, in specifically metafictional murder mystery language.
Yeah, metatextual language, that it is both. But we're talking a lot more explicitly about the psyche of our character. Whereas before we use language of magic and art and, you know, a piece of fiction is chaotic and makes you feel things. And there are many actors in the play that is our lives. Whereas now we're getting stuff that feels like it's concrete. This is a detective's deduction about how this person was feeling and thinking and acting at the time of their death, right?
We're still dealing with this metatextual crossover of realities in some respects, but we're also literalizing the text in others. And I'm sort of interested to see where we draw the line on like how much of our interpretation of this murder mystery case of the woman falling out the window that could be murder or could be suicide, but is probably both, ends up being reflective of our sort of main character's experiences rather than it is the actual literal thing that happened. Like, I do not think this character literally fell out a window.
One of the pieces of literature in the game talk about Lorelei opening up an interactive game exhibition. And by game, I mean puzzle boxes, like physical boxes.
Because we couldn't have computers at the point that the narrative is trying to pin it.
But also there are documents around how Lorelei is experimenting with computers and is excited about the prospect of them. And I do really enjoy the way the narrative ties together that critics say that the puzzle box idea is childish, but also that the computer idea is insane and way too advanced. So there's this kind of paradox where Lorelei is wanting to push the boundaries of what art is, and either they're forced to work with something that is a bit childish, or they're trying to work with something that is 100 years too early, right? Because that's the thing with the supercomputer, is that it's apparently being developed in 1960, whereas that is too early for such technology to exist. I do wonder about how Simogo feel about their ability to create the art that they want to make, whether they feel like they're kind of caught between that. And it does make me consider as well whether we're doing the right things with the technology that we have, all that sort of stuff.
Well, because one of the other things that's sort of interesting about that technological aspect is that for all of the wireframiness and visual abstraction of what's going on in the space, so far we haven't done any like non-Euclidean geometry or anything of the sort, you know?
I mean, there was the maze where we saw the fragmented depiction of the maze that we're in, and you have to use a maze that you've drawn separately from what you're seeing on screen.
There's a section where we can pick up these tiles in a maze, and when we pick them up, the screen like breaks and all of the controls are going in different directions and you can't see which part of the maze you're in, and it's all disjointed.
Yeah, it's just difficult to navigate the maze because it's not clear where your character is in the maze at any given time.
But that's so far like the closest we've gotten, and that's sort of more of a visual trick than it is like redefining space itself.
I mean, you do kind of have to navigate independently of what you're seeing, which I quite like. But I will say that the counterpoint to like, why don't we have some crazy, wacky puzzles that break my brain? And that ties into accessibility, where let's say 50% of people who are interested in the game are bounced off because it is a puzzle game, because there are puzzles. How many more people are going to get bounced off because there are complex puzzles in the game, right? And that's something that I'm sure that Simogo went back and forth on for a while. Like, how complex do we want our puzzles to be? Do we want people to get stuck? Do we want them to be tempted to look up a guide? Because I would imagine that if you ended up looking up a guide, you would be inadvertently spoiled very easily for a game like this that is metatextual and as layered as it is.
I definitely think so. And to my mind, a lot of the text we're sort of looking at the fragments of our protagonist's psyche.
The percentages of the truth.
Yeah, the percentage of the truth that we can like understand or see or comprehend or know or remember, however you want to frame it. But despite it all being about disjointedness, and despite so much of our learning being like, we find the script that this character that we're sort of in the mansion with is writing, and as we find his script, we get to see these scenes that sort of portray them as like the history of what happened. There's an interesting thing of this character, I guess, trying to comprehend the chaos of a horrible thing by making it seem as though it was like written to be that way.
But it is worth pointing out that this person who is in chaos trying to remember themselves, reconstruct themselves, there are many different artistic mediums that we're using to reframe the same events, right? Like that's part of the story, is that even though there are 100% of the truth that we need to collect, much of that truth is repetitions of the same idea from different angles, which is a literary technique that is easy to criticize depending on how it's executed. But I think that because this game uses so many different framing devices and you interact with them in different mechanical ways, right? So even though it is functionally very similar to what your character does in the game, the main part of the game, it feels different, it looks different, it sounds different. Your goal, the types of puzzle that you're solving, is different in each of the different reframings. And so even though you're repeating a lot of the same information, you're still feeling like you're discovering new things, even if it is the same ideas repeated over and over again.
To quote hit jazz educator Adam Neely, repetition legitimizes. And I think this game, like through that blend of restraint and sort of trusting its narrative to bridge the divide between relatively simple puzzles and a big, complex, thematically driven, abstract story, it's so many weird pieces coming together to make something that feels very comprehensive.
I'm looking forward to getting to the end and seeing these characters who we know to be the same character, like, have a drama and resolve each other, maybe not necessarily spelling out the highest level of the metatext. You know, that's kind of where I'm expecting the resolution to go. But I'm sure that whatever they end up doing, wherever the actual level of resolution is, I'm sure it'll be really cool and interesting and creative.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. We are talking Simogo's 2024 puzzle mystery video game, Lorelei and the Laser Eyes. Stick around, more to come on your Murder Mystery World Tour. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. Now, continuing our discussion from last week, while we look at the personal purgatory of Lorelei Weiss, or at least that's what we think it is so far. We're yet to actually find out, and I'm very excited for that. We want to throw over to more of our discussion with Vanessa McCausland on her book, The Last Illusion of Paige White, a fitting parallel for this game, I think. So take it away. And I guess the other character we have, this third narrator in the book, Audrey, very much has this other aspect of the past reflecting the present in the same way that Jane and Paige reflect each other in the present day. Tell me a little bit about that reflection in the lake and how Audrey shines that sort of light into the past for us.
In all my books, I use the past to sort of elucidate the present and to build a bigger picture of what's informing the mystery. And I've done this with The Last Illusion of Paige White as well in the character of Audrey, and we sort of see how it's slowly revealed the relationship that she has to the two characters in the present. And it's really interesting. Each one of these women, their voices just came to me so clearly, and they were all in very different times and places. And Audrey is the only sort of window into the past. Paige is the window into this sort of beyond, and Jane is the solid present. Yeah. And so it felt structurally very good to have those three elements and weave them all together. So there's just like this slow drip of how, Paige and Jane's struggles are affected by the past and what's gone on. And I have to say that was really, really fun to play with and to draw out, and you have to read it to find out what it means.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things about that lens into the past that struck me as like so odd is I think this is the first book I've read where we're diving back into the past, where social media is still a part of the past in some respects. When
I sort of researched into it, I was thinking it's kind of early 2000s, and they probably would have only had flip phones. Yeah. Like that was kind of it. And I mean, it might have been an early iteration of like MySpace or something, but that was the one place that they didn't actually sort of have this.
Yeah, it's like it's a very different context, I think, but just the way that you framed the early imagery we got as Audrey was first introduced to the story of like what her life was like back home, that like exclusion in the same way that people aren't let into certain groups, like both in a social context, but it felt very much like the caging of early social media there was something that was interesting to me.
Interesting, yeah.
Talking of these three characters, you mentioned Paige's parents before. All of these parental figures in the story provide this interesting backdrop because we get to see them in the different timelines, in the different framing, in the different purgatories of these characters. What was the role of the parents in this story to you? Both from like a structural perspective, but also what they were meant to say about the characters they were the parent of.
Paige's parents are a big part of the book, her father being the priest. And there's also in this book a very clear sort of socioeconomic divide. So Paige White has this perfect family with this very influential father. They're all beautiful. They have a gorgeous house on the lake. Jane grew up on the wrong side of the lake. She grew up with, parents that had issues. We discover fairly early that her father has a hoarding problem. His house is literally sort of falling into the lake and disintegrating, and that's sort of a source of shame for Jane. And so I think in a way the familial surrounds around these characters was a way to look into the socioeconomic divide and how that informed these girls' friendships to a certain degree. And I also just think families are fascinating because, families are always hiding secrets from each other, and just that idea that parents often just think of their child as one way and the child will grow up into an adult. They're still treating that child like they are 10, just that way that you get locked into certain things in families, and I wanted to explore that tension as well.
Well, I think it was also really good because of the way that, in particular, Paige's family in the past mainly provides a point of conflict, but in the present mainly provides a point of support, and looking at how the characters sort of move in contrast to that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with Paige's family, they're questionable.
Oh yeah, I mean the image of the birthday party for a funeral is just brilliant.
Yeah, and it's just like Jane's just wandering around going, why is everyone seeming so happy? And I think that was me also looking at partly the religion aspect because I've had experience of that and they can be very let's just be happy and that's Paige's mother, right? She won't actually engage with the fact that her daughter is gone. She's just keeping this happy, smiling face and everything's great. And I guess I really wanted to explore how that can kind of be pretty creepy. And there's definitely a sort of strangely cultish vibe that I think we start getting around Paige's family. And it's like, are they perfect and wonderful, or does that actually tip over into something a little creepy?
There's two main parts to that. The first, I think, is that, obviously death sort of has this interesting natural conflict where from a religious perspective, you believe that the person who has passed has gone to a better place, but you are still without them. But also that the Tree Cathedral also has this brilliant role where it is at once this beautiful, bowing arches, very winding and convalescent, but as much when it needs to conserve the role of being like, oh, that looks like a bunch of creepy, horrible vines.
Yes, absolutely. I loved playing with that dual side. At once it's ethereal and then it's also, there's the eels and the mud and the rotting leaf litter. And I think nature is a really, really important part of my stories. And I love how nature can go from being shiny, sunny, bright, and then it can be really ominous and actually terrifying. And so I loved using that sort of flip side.
Yeah, I mean, the one that really stands out to me then, now that you mention it, is that there's at once this discussion of like above the surface with the beautiful reflections on the lake and below the surface where it's murky, dark, as you were mentioning. But also, as you were saying before with Jane's family, the like good and bad side of the lake horizontally, where this like social stratification matters almost as much as this natural stratification.
That's exactly what I was intending in a way. And then, you could take that into sort of Instagram and the online world as well. And there's this beautiful side to it where it's so seductive and we all get drawn into it. But then there's this really, really negative, ugly side to it where it can just destroy your self-esteem.
And to drag us back to where we started, looking at like their purgatories and the separation between like journalism and social media, something that's really fascinating there is this idea that it is very much the structure of like social media wants you to post more, and so you do that, and it takes away from the things that you are posting about. Journalism wants you to investigate more, but in trying to sell that, it takes away that detail, as you were talking about with the headlines. When both of these industries that we have so much discussion about in the present day feel so similar, do you think that there is like a core takeaway that can deal with both problems?
Just nature. That's a massive theme in the book. And I find for myself, who has worked as a journalist, who has been sucked in by social media, I just get off my phone, I get off my computer, and I just get into nature. I put my feet on the ground and everything feels a hell of a lot better. Yeah. And, that's how we lived thousands of years ago. Yeah. That's how we lived up until so recently. And I do think that as humans, we were potentially a lot happier without social media. And, the media still does play an important role. But, with the speed at which people want to consume news, there's nothing quality anymore. And so it's just a fine line. Social media and the media are both valid things, but it's just going too far.
Well, I also think it's so much fun there because at once you pose that as a personal solution to separate from it, but also in going to nature, we get into all of that dichotomous imagery of things that are equal parts beautiful and terrifying. And I love there that your idea of the personal solution is potentially as monstrous in some ways as the thing you're trying to avoid.
We can't get away from it. I mean, that's
great.
just life, right? Life is light and shade. It always will be. But I think the takeaway in some way is awe. So I write a little bit about this in the book, and just that sense that in nature we see something bigger than ourselves, which then ties back into the religion theme.
Vanessa McCausland there talking about her novel, The Last Illusion of Paige White. Thank you very much to HarperCollins for sending us a copy of that book and helping arrange our time with Paige. Fantastic read and definitely a highlight of the end of the year. We're going to jump back over to Lorelei and the Laser Eyes now. Stick around, more to come on your Murder Mystery World Tour. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are talking Lorelei and the Laser Eyes, developed by Simogo, published by Annapurna Interactive, came out earlier this year. Now, usually, spoilers are pretty clear when we're in part 2. We're starting to get into the weeds. We're starting to pick our theories. But because this is a game that has a different set of mechanics to the rules of a book, I thought I should warn you just now that this is the point to stop if you haven't played the game yourself. It's a really unique experience, and I highly recommend it. Listen on if you don't think you're going to play it, but be warned. Past me, take it away. We've sort of got like an interesting thing going on where the script pages that we've been taking up to the man who's in the mansion with us contain what seem to be memories of the character that we're controlling's recent memory. I think the big culmination of that was a phone call to the producers of the film that we're supposedly working on, saying you need to get out, only for the last page of the script to address us in second person.
And also in both past and future tenses, it says you will continue to work on the project forever, was kind of the implication. There's this idea that our character is being orchestrated down a designated path, which is always fun.
Also, when we actually handed in the scripts to the 1963 room where we thought Renzo Nero was, we get in there and there are a bunch of other scripts that are also for the film that we're working on, but the film doesn't actually seem to be the same.
Effectively, there are 4 characters that we're following. There's Renate the artist, who is our murder victim. There's Lorenzo the magician, who is cryptic. They seem to hold a lot more knowledge than everybody else. They seem to be the oldest sort of personality.
And we still think that all 4 of them are the same character.
But the game is asking us to kind of plug into the details of their relationship with each other. This is Lorenzo, who's telling us to get out and kind of seems to know what's going on but doesn't want to tell us directly. There's our character. Our role is the dreamer. That's what we're described as. And then there's Renzo, who is the creator. But it would seem as though, based on how the 9 pages are scattered around the floor, that when we pushed the pages under the door, instead of being like picked up by whoever's on the other side, they kind of were pushed through, slid across the floor, and the 9 pages that we saw have transformed into the 9 pages that depict Lorenzo and Renate and their drama.
But the interesting thing is that in the final page of Lorenzo and Renate's drama, where Renate is pushed out the window that sort of precipitates the crime, sort of seems to be happening maybe in parallel with the 4th page of the script that we pushed under the door, if we're trying to line them up. I don't necessarily think that we should. But where on the last page that we put through, we were spoken to in second person, instead, it seems Renzo's voice starts to come through Renate as he's talking about the artistic decisions influencing the scene that Renate is acting out, but breaking the 4th wall of by speaking as Renzo.
Her voice literally changed to that of a man, because we're all the same character, but in that moment, it's Renzo's authoritative voice. And he, as the creator, of course, is writing the script. He's, to some degree, writing what the different personalities will do. I also like that Renate turns into paint at the end, because she's a creation, right? She's turning back into her raw material. And so it does kind of shed light on the overarching mystery of the significance of these characters, and also the schism that they're dealing with, where like these characters have had this conflict and they're kind of reconciling the fact that they are creations, I suppose. How that translates to the actual physical person that they are all a part of is, I think, what I'm kind of most curious about at the moment, though.
Yeah, I presume that we're going to end up with a very simple message about a way that the character like sees themselves. But as you sort of insinuate there, how much of an actual explanation of the events that we are exploring and how much of it gets left to the metaphor and abstraction, I think, is becoming increasingly interesting to me, because we have so many more literal seeming pieces of information that continue to be practically incompatible.
But of course, in terms of our objectives in the game, I mentioned 3 sort of core puzzles, but there's actually a 4th one. There's an old woman upstairs on her deathbed in a hospital, supposedly. And we've been asked to determine a list of seemingly basic facts about her. What is her name? Who are her friends? What band did she like growing up? And I imagine that those details will be the concrete facts that we leave the game with of the holistic person that these personalities are a part of, right?
The other thing that's interesting about that sort of hospital bed setup is that it's one of the first rooms that you get to unlock in the game, but it's also a room we've almost been hanging on to the longest with the least information. And I think because you're right, that will be the concrete information we leave the game
imagine
with.
that once we tell this character all of the details about their life, that'll probably be the end. Because in the metatextual sense, right, we have all these different layers, and that seems like the closest to the surface, as it were. Once we spiral down to the bottom, we dive to the surface, you might say.
In the fiction, the artist is the one that has died, and the dreamer is the one that is sort of being held hostage.
Well, the dreamer is figuring out what's going on, right? It's her job to comprehend and put everybody else back together, in a way.
How that factors into our broad metatext of, like, the person that we're exploring. What is the death of the artist in the context of this person's life?
Like, the implication through just the subtext and the fact that Renzo is walking around with a smoking gun and blood on his shoes is that the creator has killed the artist. And I'm kind of scared to find out exactly what that means, because the game keeps talking about money and the Americans funding. And I wonder if the message there is about how art is killed by publishers, essentially. Like, I don't want to put any more detail into that before we've learnt, but I feel like that's where we're going, that in order to create art, you need funding, and that can kill the creative spirit of a work.
The Renzo Nero character that has been in the mansion with us, through all of his different apparitions, has this, like, sort of 2 main facets. One is this, like, very funny, witty, all sorts of one-liners, like, you know, no one trusts the hiker that begs for more forest type. The other is constantly, as you say, like, barracking, like, oh goodness, we need to get money out of this, we need to get money out of this, while there are all of these scattered American dollar bills in this German hotel. While we're on that, can we talk about the first-person shooter sequence in this game?
It's great.
There's not a lot to talk about, but that was one of the greatest video game medium-only jokes.
It kind of ties in with the thought that I've just had, because all the times when he's shown up, he said, you know, I would like to dance with you. I would like to listen to you play the piano. I would like to have you shoot me with a gun. But in particularly the dancing scene and the gun scene, it's our character's response, apparently, that has changed it from something deadly serious, you know, a somber dance, somebody getting shot in the head with a gun, turned it into a bit. You know, you call him an idiot, you turn the gun into a toy. This is the role of the dreamer, right? It's to think of things that aren't possible, which I guess I'm thinking about it again on the magic layer, let's call it, the magic layer of our many layers here. I feel like what we're doing is very similar to what the magician would do. So I don't know. I guess I'm still kind of I'm still thinking through this, but it is interesting that we take the literal things that the creator is doing and we turn them into fantastical things. I think that's really cool.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are talking Lorelei and the Laser Eyes, developed by Simogo. We'll be back with our final episode for the year, our final discussion on this game. All spoilers in the house next week on the show, so stay tuned for that. If you want to join us, we'll be up on YouTube, which you can also get via the 2SER website, 2SER.com. Catch you then. We're out of here. and a Merry Christmas to you.